Getting back to your song now, it's one song, and I'm probably going to misquote this. Back in Sunset Blvd, you said you never formalize or finalize, you only rearrange. And now you seem to have come full circle to where no second takes.
Yeah.
Was that, in Sunset Blvd, was that more of a legal situation? Or was that
I think it's a long time back now, but I think what I'm probably referring to is this sense of taking preordained elements of things and bolting them together in some kind of unnatural structure, rearranging things that already exist, and it becoming something else, which is kind of a little bit of everything but nebulous, and you can't quite put your finger on it. I was explaining to the other guy when we were talking about how bebop started and how I perceived the music to be at the time, and I definitely wanted to do this sort of scanning through the whole history of popular music, or popular culture in general, not just music culture, but visual culture and film culture, and somehow make reference points and make a kind of a gumbo soup out of the whole thing. And it is really what people think is postmodernism now, but at the time the term didn't exist. That postmodernism, I guess, concerns itself with that knowingness of previous structure and concept, and also the use of irony and the way that those things can be manipulated and put together to comment on themselves. So I think maybe that line in Reviews seems to refer to that. But with the more recent stuff, it's a double-edged sword, this sort of do it and leave it and don't interfere with it. It produces a very honest statement, but sometimes there is a possibility that there are areas unexplored that the music could have been introduced to or taken into, that because of this cut-off point that you make, that possibility never can arise. That's what it is, and it stays what it is. And also, it's not always a choice made by myself that's the way it has to be. It's more of a choice imposed on the situation by budget or by technical limitations. If somebody gave me 2 months in a studio as opposed to a month or something, I think I would probably indulge and use it and do more and develop the ideas even further. The fact that I'm limited to a certain time, I have to say, okay, well that's it, and then afterwards I can justify it if anybody says, well, it's not quite finished, is it? You go, well, I only had 4 weeks, but then again, it's honest. That's exactly what I did in that time, and there was no time for anything else. So, it's a nebulous line that between it being forced upon you and it being something that you choose to do and limit yourself at that point.
You in the 70s you played guitar. In the 80s you kind of put the guitar aside and did keyboard, and you got into the rhythm machine and stuff, and you also got into the sound button, snippet type stuff.
Before sampling.
Analog sampling. Cutting on tape. And now on your newest record, it seems you have every single element there. You play guitar, you sing, there's the sound pipes, there's the drum machines. Is it just the cycle happens to coincide on this record, or were you just using everything you've known?
Well, with Practically Wired, it was a pulling together of the previous album. It was pulling together the guitar things really into something that commented on the whole my experience of electric guitar, which is my experience of electric guitar from the beginning, where other people's influences were very strong, and so it was referring back to that and tying it together in some way that was palatable for anybody coming into a cold, as it were. With the vocal album, I think, with the new one, I wanted to take some of what I've done with Practically Wired and then apply that to the vocal side of things. So it would be kind of Practically Wired Mark II plus vocals. And also, there is a tremendous amount of recordings available, or have been available over the years. I lost count, but there's around 52 different albums.
Of your stuff?
Yeah. and I'm 48 this year, so it's kind of, okay, let's just acknowledge the past for once, instead of running away from it, which is what I've done for years. I ran away from Be Bop Deluxe, I ran away from Red Nights, you know. It's like, what's the next thing? I've finished, that's dead, let's move on. And people say, oh, I really like that, and I'd be really annoyed. But how dare you, you know, I've got a new record out, you can't like the old one. And now I'm realising that, you know, I was totally wrong to say that. I mean, you know, right to impose those kind of structures on somebody else's listening. And, so I felt, you know, yeah, it's a time to sort of take stock and to reassess things and to actually, I think I'm old enough and I've done enough work, I've proved myself in enough different areas to be able to kind of quote myself a little bit and to put a signature in there. And I do things now intentionally where I'll put a phrase in that I know somebody's going to spot that this has come from this point in a Be Bop Deluxe track somewhere. And I hope that they do spot it, because if they do spot it, they'll get the same smile that made me think of it at the time. But it's a reference back, which led to this, which then, there's all kinds of layers which you can interpret music on. And unfortunately it happens to a lot of people when they get older. But then, you know, there's a guy called Dennis Potter, an English TV playwright, who died a year ago of cancer, and he knew he was going to die, and actually went on TV and did this interview under a lot of pain. He had a hip flask which had a combination of brandy, morphine and heroin in it, so whilst he was doing it, and he made no bones, but this has got this in it, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have a swig. Okay, continue with the interview. And this was like weeks away from him dying, and he was writing this piece as he was dying, which has now just been made and it's been shown by both BBC and Channel 4 TV in England. It's been serialised. It's called Karaoke. Well, it's a two-part thing. One part goes right up to for several episodes, and then it becomes another play called Cold Lazarus, which is set in the future, but the characters are linked. And he's getting a lot of stick in the press, a lot of criticism about it, saying it's not as good as his other stuff. But it's full of references to his other stuff. And you know, this is the guy's last work, and he's looking back and he's going, okay, I've done this, I'm going to acknowledge it. Whereas he's always been a guy that's moved on. It's a bit scary when I start doing that, when I see somebody that's about to die. And Cocteau did it in his last movie, in Testament of Orpheus. I mean, he put himself in it, and it's full of references to his work. And again, the critics said this isn't his best thing because he's not inventing anymore, he's just reassembling his own myth. But people do that. And I don't think it's something you do just for fun. I think it's something you do at a certain point in your creative life. It's a way of taking stock, and it's a way of kind of clearing the things so you can go forward. And I think I think Dennis Potter would have written this kind of thing anyway, regardless of whether he was about to die or not. I think it's just a stage you get to where you evaluate what you've done, and you want to know you have to remind yourself, because particularly when you do a lot of work, it slips away into a fog and you forget, you know, people know more about some of the other records and that kind of thing. So, you know, your fans come and tell me things that I've not forgotten. So, now and again, it's good to remember.
Who have you worked with you've worked with many people over the years. Who was your most enjoyable experience collaborating with?
One of the most precious experiences was Harold Blood. Harold lives in LA. I called him to the phone last night, and the bugger's gone to Phoenix to make an album, so he's not here. But we did an album for All Saints Records called By the Dawn's Early Light. It's actually Harold's album. Harold asked me to collaborate with him on it. We recorded it at Daniel Landmar's studio in New Orleans, Kingsway Recordings, which was just a fabulous place. I mean, it wasn't a purpose-built recording studio. It's a beautiful old plantation mansion, which is kind of gothic and candlelit. And we just sat around in a circle, all the musicians, and improvised by candlelight. Or rather, I improvised. Harold had written everybody else's parts out for them, because I can't read music. He knew there's no point in giving me any paper, so he just said, look, I'll give you a nod where I want you to start playing. You play as long as you want. When you get towards the end of what you want to play, just give us a nod and we'll move it up to the next level, you know. And And meanwhile, you know, just sort of fit in where you can. So it was really carte blanche, which is nice. And I mean, the recording experience itself was just fabulous. The atmosphere of the place, the music itself, and Harold is just one of the most genuinely creative people I've ever met. You know, there's a lot of fakes around. There's people who bandy the word art about, like some kind of designer label jackets. You know, but Harold's the real thing. And I've met very few people in music, particularly in popular music, although Harold wouldn't class himself as a popular musician, who can really sort of use that with any sense of dignity. He's a genius as well, that concerned.
Is there anybody you haven't worked with that you'd like to?
I'd like to work with some of the new wave of people in England. I mean, there's a guy called Tricky and a guy called Goldie. You know, like, they're very much in the jungle and drum and bass style. I like Be Bop very much.
She has a great voice.
Yeah, and her arrangements and all the structural things. And I'm not a great fan of the Britpop bands. I'm afraid I'm too old for that because I've been there and done it, you know. And it was better the first time around.
The first time being 70s
well,
or the 80s?
Late 60s, you know. I mean, bands like Oasis and Blur, I mean, they're still making references to the Kings and the Beatles and the Small Faces and so on. The only one of those bands that I really like is Pulp, because they have a certain irony about them, and they've got sort of they're a little bit theatrical, and it's ironic because somebody actually wrote about them and said, or did a review of one of my things recently, and in doing so referred back to Be Bop Deluxe and said that Be Bop Deluxe were kind of a pulp for the 70s. What pulp is to the 90s, Be Bop Deluxe in the 70s. And I was a Jarvis Cocker in the 70s for some reason. Thought, but I can see there's some similarities. You know. So I like pulp, but Blur and Oasis, whilst they're quite good players and everything, I mean, to be honest, you know, if I listen to that kind of music, there's 100 bands that did it better 30 years ago, so